Hello, my name is Susan Lutz, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. It is my pleasure to welcome you on this Tuesday afternoon to the Sisters of Auschwitz by Roxane von Iperen. This is the 70th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair, and we're celebrating with an entire year of book and story programming. Join us as we honor the world's first Jewish book fair, highlighting diverse authors, curating new Jewish writing, and promoting the global art of Jewish storytelling. Our festival week, which continues through Sunday, November 14th, is just the beginning. Be sure to come back all year for exceptional opportunities to engage with the best of Jewish books and authors. To see our full event schedule, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find the Sisters of Auschwitz, the true story of two Jewish sisters' resistance in the heart of Nazi Germany, and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts. Visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. If you enjoyed this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to Book Fair. You can do either or both at our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair. We rely on community support to make this annual event possible, so thank you in advance for becoming part of the family. The Book Fair team would like to thank you the following for their support. Day sponsors, Elaine and Michael Serling. Co-sponsors, the Voice Vision Holocaust Survival Oral History Archive at the University of Michigan Dearborn Mardigian Library, and Randy and Paul Friedman. I also want to extend our deepest gratitude to the whole Book Fair committee. Your dedication, innovation, commitment, and hard work have made all of this possible. We have an incredible event for you this afternoon, and we want you to be part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. The focus of today's event is the Sisters of Auschwitz, the true story of two Jewish sisters' resistance in the heart of Nazi territory. We have with us the author of the book, Roxane von Iperen, as well as Professor Anna Muller of the University of Michigan Dearborn, who will moderate the discussion. The Sisters of Auschwitz is an unforgettable story of two unsung heroes of World War II, sisters who joined the Dutch resistance, helped save dozens of lives, were captured by the Nazis, and ultimately survived the Holocaust. Based on meticulous research and unprecedented access to the sisters' personal archives of memoirs and photos, Sisters of Auschwitz is a long overdue homage to two young women's heroism and moral bravery, and a reminder of the power each of us has to change the world. Roxane von Iperen is a Dutch writer and lawyer who resides in the countryside east of Amsterdam. She lives in the High Nest, once a safe house for Jews during World War II. The original Dutch version of the Sisters of Auschwitz was shortlisted for the biggest public prize in Holland, the NS Audience Award Book of the Year. Our moderator, Anna Muller, is the Frank and Mary Padzieski Endowed Professor in Polish and Eastern European Studies at the University of Michigan Dearborn. Please join me in welcoming Roxane von Iperen and Anna Muller.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Roxane. Good afternoon, or perhaps I should say good evening, because you are coming to us from Europe. We're so grateful to have you here. And I have to say that I'm very grateful, and I would like to thank you, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to learn more about your work and your beautiful book, The Sisters of Auschwitz. I'm familiar with the history of the Holocaust in Poland and Eastern Europe and the place that Auschwitz played in the Nazi order. But I have to admit that I am less familiar with the areas that you deal with in your book. So, your book was certainly a very informative, but also a very emotional journey, the one for which I am very grateful. You brought us the image of Nazi brutality in the Netherlands and the limited choices that were available to Dutch Jews to continue at last some aspects of their previous lives, but also to enjoy life as much as it was possible in the conditions of war, fear, surveillance. And finally, in that context, you painted a very compelling image of the struggle of the entire family that included two sisters, Yanni and Lien Braceslaper, and I do apologize if I am mispronouncing the name.
Great.
Women who became members of the Dutch resistance, sheltering a group of Jews in a clandestine safe house in the woods called the High Nest. And in your work, you bring a very precise historical context, but also moving detail that tells us a lot about individual lives. But you also, on the example of your own story, seems to me, show how much this larger Holocaust history lives with us or next to us, how much elements of this horrific past are ingrained into our lives in often surprising ways, and sometimes, without us knowing about it. And this is very much part of your own story, or at least an impulse to tell this story. So I'm thrilled to be here and have this opportunity to have a conversation with you about your book and your work. So perhaps we could begin with a rather general question. And while asking my questions, I prepared a number of questions, but I will try to monitor the questions in the chat and include them in our conversation. But if you see something that I am missing, please go ahead and integrate, answer the questions that we see in the chat. So can we start with something general? Could you speak about what inspired you to write this book? Why did you think it was important for you to tell this story?
Yes, well, thank you, Anna, for such a lovely introduction. Thank you for reading the book. What an honor. I know your work, and it's very impressive. Well, basically, the inspiration for the book, like you said, it was just pure chance, daily life. We moved from Amsterdam to, like a lot of people do when they have children. We moved from the city to a quieter place, which is about 20 kilometers away from Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands. And we fell in love with this very old house in the woods. It used to be in the middle of nowhere, and now it's still located in the woods, but the neighborhood is, it's built up until the house. But the house was still very, it's a bit an anarchist house. It has like a big wild garden, and it's in the forest with red shutters. So we immediately fell in love with this house, and we were like, okay, if we can raise our children here, and that would be, a dream come true. And as soon as we moved into the house and we had to do a lot of renovation on the walls and on the floors, there was no heating inside. There were, no modern facilities. So it was quite a renovation that we did. And in a lot of the rooms we found in the walls and in the floors, in the walls, and also in the ceilings, we found hidden spaces. So hatches with things beneath. And well, as most people can relate. If you've ever done a renovation, you're more concerned with saving your marriage than with, finding the things in the house that are, maybe interesting. So it was at that moment not like, oh, this is a book or this is exciting. It was more like, okay, this is interesting. But not, I had no idea that this story was behind it. But being a journalist, I used to be a lawyer, I'm now an investigative journalist. I thought, what is behind these hidden spaces? Was it just for blankets or for, ordinary things? Or is there actually a history behind it? And then we found some old music, Yiddish music, and we found resistance papers. So, I began to do my own research, investigation, starting with the people that live in the villages around the house. And then I got really agitated because one story was it was a Nazi house, and another story was no, there was a Dutch family, a non-Jewish Dutch family taking in Jewish Dutch families. And another said, no, it was the Dutch branch of the Nazi Party, which was called the NSB, the National Socialist Movement, the NSB. So all these stories were so contradicting that to me, as a journalist and as a human being, I thought, it cannot be Jewish people and Nazis in the same house. So I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And quite early on, I discovered that in some history books, the house was linked to Jannie and Lien Brilleslijper, two Amsterdam sisters from a very liberal Jewish family. So they didn't really identify as being Jewish primarily. And those sisters, I knew their names because they are mentioned at the Anne Frank Museum. And I think even in America, if I mention Anne Frank, probably most of you will, recognize that name. And of course, in the Netherlands, she is, everybody knows her. It's the Jewish girl that did not survive the war and became famous when her diary was published. And in the Anne Frank Museum, it is mentioned that her father, Otto Frank, he survived the war and he placed an ad in a newspaper saying, has anybody seen my girls? Do you know if they survived the camps? I'm looking for my girls, Anne and Margot. And in the museum it says, sisters Jannie and Lien Brilleslijper were the ones to tell Otto Frank that his two daughters had died in Bergen-Belsen, the third camp that they were sent to. So I knew that name and I thought, oh my God, so those sisters that found or at least lived with Anne and Margot Frank in Bergen-Belsen, they lived in this house, and why is there nobody in the neighborhood that could tell me that story? So that was the start of 6 years of research all over the world, leading to the Sisters of Auschwitz. The original book is called The High Nest, and that's the name of the house. So to answer your question, I'm sorry it took so long.
That is absolutely fascinating, and I have so many questions sort of as part of the story that you just said that I shouldn't probably ask. I'll just mention them. I'm very curious about what happened to those hiding spaces, whether you renovated them, whether you're still in the house. How do you use those spaces, and how do you tell the story of those spaces when you have guests? And do you have guests from the city if you live in this in the same house, who are just interested in that history?
Mm-hmm.
But maybe that's something we can leave aside for now, unless you're interested in exploring that further, because I think the larger question that I'm also interested in, you sort of mentioned that the research started while you were renovating the house, and that in itself is a sort of a very symbolic moment, right? You were renovating a house, preparing you yourself and your family for a new life in this charming, it seems to me, part of the city. So I'm very interested in the process of researching and writing. If I understood you well, you said it took 6 years, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm very interested in how that research process looked like. What was first for you, interviewing people or looking for larger historical literature? You intersect very skillfully this historical context, the establishment of Westerbork, Auschwitz, the role of Dutch Railway Company, with the story of this one particular family. So I would really be grateful if you could unravel a little bit how that process looked like, what was challenging, and why did you decide, maybe that's sort of another question, why did you decide to write it in this very personal way of reconstructing, or perhaps at times even creating specific dialogues and scene, and how much of your own licencia poetica is there in the book?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I started off very traditionally with a combination of how I always work, which is between how I used to work as a lawyer and how I now work as a journalist, which is always very factual. So first, you discover all the facts, but then I also think everyone should do that, not only lawyers or journalists, but have a sense of context. Because the facts, this family, the sisters, you can only understand their bravery and the horrendous situation they were in if you understand the full context of the situation at that moment. So I knew from my generation, I'm 45, and I mean, the Netherlands, we have a very present narrative about the war still, 1940, 1945. But there's also this sense of, we've had enough of the war in my generation. Like, I don't want to hear those stories again. And so I knew there was this war fatigue in my own country. And I thought, the reason for that is what I thought during the research is because we hear the same story over and over and over again, which is the joke that everybody told me when I was doing research abroad. The first thing they said when I told them I was from the Netherlands, they said, "Oh, all your grandfathers were in the resistance, right?" That's basically how we are known in the world. That we are this people that always say, yes, we were all in the resistance. When during my research, and if you look at the facts, and historians know that, but the broader audience doesn't, we were not brave at all as a people. 75% of our Dutch Jews were taken away and murdered, which is the highest number of Eastern Europe. So the narrative that is in our collective memory and the facts are quite contradictory. So I thought, I have to do two things. First of all, this amazing story of two Jewish sisters in the resistance. So you have female resistance, which I'd never heard about. Jewish resistance, even less talked about. No, hardly any movies, hardly any literature in the Netherlands. But then again, I thought, if my generation reads this book, I didn't know if they were going to read it, but I hope my generation would read it, then in one book, they should read and learn about the entire war, which is, it's a lot, but I thought, those are the two goals that I have. So it's the big story of, the day the Germans occupied the Netherlands, the part of the ministers, of the Queen, of the police, of the railroad, like you said, the notary, lawyers, real estate. Basically, everybody in the upper echelon of the Netherlands cooperated or even enhanced, tried to, do something actively to help the Germans efficiently take away the Dutch Jews. So that's one story I wanted to tell. And the other part of the investigation was, how can I recreate a day-to-day, on day-to-day basis, exactly what those sisters did. And that's where, what you say, that's where the intimate scenes come from, the dialogues and looking through their eyes as they go through those 5 war years.
I'm sorry, I just got lost listening to you, forgot that I muted. So would you mind saying a little bit more about the specificity of those dialogues? Like how much of this is the actual historical reconstruction and how much of this is your interpretation, maybe your creativity that contributes to the reconstruction of certain scenes and mostly dialogues, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, I started off writing the book in a very traditional, non-fictional way, which is, how I write my journalistic pieces. But I'm also a novelist, so I knew there are so many great history books out there, and you know yourself, you're in the field, and it's very difficult to, draw uninterested people into those books. And I wanted to write for an uninterested audience. The ones that say, oh, I don't like a war book. Oh, I don't want to read anything about the Second World War again. And I thought, how can I, because as a journalist, I write about the radical right movement. I write about, Brazil post dictatorship and the upcoming of Bolsonaro. And I wrote about, Trump a lot. I wrote about, all these daily political topics. And I know you can lose your audience really quick if you become, technical or, so I thought, I can write it in a very traditional non-fictional way, or I can try and use more tools of storytelling. So I basically ended up with, I think, about 800 pages of very dry raw material. And I thought, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. I need a very strong composition of this book. So I thought, I want to maybe max 400 pages, and I'm going to write it like the Jewish persecution. And the Jewish persecution is mentioned by one of the sisters. She visualizes it as a funnel. And a funnel is, I picture it as something like this, a triangle upside down. So you get it in the broad area, and then you get stuck and you can't, there's no turning back. And one of the sisters says, they hunted us and we ended up in a funnel and there was no way back. So I thought, that's how I have to write the book. So first, I separated it in 3 parts. The first part is very factual, very dry, typically nonfiction, because that's the part where all the Dutch people still think we're going to be okay. The Germans always considered us a Brudervolk, a brother people. We're Aryan people. They're not going to be aggressive like they are, your specialization, like they are in the Eastern countries. So that's the first part. Then the second part, it narrows down. You have the scary feeling of the razzia, of being hunted down, of the law changing, the discrimination, stereotype, exclusion of Jewish people. And then the very last part, and that's the part where you refer to, when you really, as a reader, get into the skin of specifically the youngest sister, early 20s, Yanni. And as a reader, it becomes very uncomfortable because you are with her in the camps, first Westerbork, then Auschwitz, then Bergen-Belsen. And there is the last piece of the funnel, which of course for the Jewish population ended in the gas chamber. And I wanted the book to feel as uncomfortable, but that you cannot stop reading as a reader. So that's how I thought of the composition.
That is beautiful explanation. Thank you so much. It actually, because while reading this book, I couldn't decide whether I'm reading it as a historian or as somebody who is learning the story, as somebody who really doesn't know much about the context, the story. So there were a couple of sort of those aha moments and like reflecting and thinking about you and your own position and the decisions you took as a writer. And I have to say, it was very convincing. It was very powerful. I finally managed to figure out where the question is. So I started seeing questions coming in. I will start asking them, but let me ask a couple more questions before we move to the questions from the board. You collected a lot of oral interviews, right? And listened also to a number of oral interviews that were already recorded. Again, would you mind commenting on this process? Was there anything that you found challenging in that process, or perhaps rewarding? And another sort of part of this question is, did you manage to find witnesses that were not previously recorded, the voices that were not heard yet?
Yes, indeed. Well, like I said, I started off with basic, normal research in the archives, varying from just local villages and asking people to help me find the oldest newspapers, and of course, a lot of digitalized these days. But still, you have to go to places and ask people, please help me, and please, do you have something that isn't available anymore? And then you find these really interesting Nazi written books, which nobody, sells online anymore, but which are very helpful, because then you can say, okay, so who wrote this? Who is this person? And then you have a starting point, and you get to other important archives. In the Netherlands, you have an institute, the Institute of War Documentation, and if you have permission from the family, or if you can prove that there is a special interest, then they open up confidential files for you. So I had both. So I had permission from a lot of families, and in the case of Jew hunters, they are called Jew hunters in the Netherlands, which is a horrible word, but which is literally what they were. Dutch, not German, Dutch boys and men that were Jew hunting for money. And I got access to those files, which are of course very important, because that made me reconstruct how the house was betrayed. But then very importantly, and of course, I went to Yad Vashem and well, a lot of important archives in the United States. But most importantly for me, to fill in all the blanks and create this intimate voice of the sisters, was the family. The family that were actually in hiding in this place and in this room where I am right now, which is my my working space. And I was a bit afraid at first, because I thought, I'm maybe messing up their lives. I'm, writing a book about this house and about their mothers. But, they are family now. After so many years of research, they are actually, our extended family. They all returned to the house. They are 80, end 70s or early 80s. They all returned to the house, and they gave me full cooperation. So all the diaries of the sisters, and the love letters with their husbands, and the small notes they left on the kitchen table for their children, everything. So if you're wondering, how can you create those dialogues? I had two sisters, and one sister writes in her diary, my stupid hard-headed sister who doesn't want to listen to me, and I know better because I'm smarter than her. And then I have the other side writing, my stupid sister. And so it was quite easy for me to reconstruct their discussions that they had during the war.
I will take one question from the audience. It's a question about the actual history rather than research. There is also a question about the story and the sisters, but for that, I think we can recommend just reading your book, right? To sort of learn more details about the sisters themselves. So why did the Danes cooperate with the German occupation, turning over the Jews? I don't know if you would like to comment on that. That's one of the questions from the audience.
The Danes or the Dutch? I think the Dutch.
The Dutch.
The Dutch.
The Dutch.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of research done, and it's it's as always, it's a complex of factors. But one is that, like in other countries as well, there is a long history of anti-Semitism in the Netherlands. I mean, that's one. So it was not strange to the non-Jewish Dutch population that the Jewish people were, aimed at. Another important factor is that the Dutch were very opportunist people. So they, for instance, we have this very famous, well, infamous map in the Netherlands that Dutch people, for the Dutch government people created. The Germans never even asked for it. But, Dutch people thought, we have this really good idea so we can catch the Jews even quicker to deport them to the east. So they created this infamous thing called the dot map. And it's actually a map of the Netherlands. And on it, the government officials very meticulously put red dots on it. And one dot was for a family of Jews. So you have this horrible map of Amsterdam, where you see that, especially, of course, the Jewish quarter, and if you've ever visited Amsterdam, almost the entire old ancient center of Amsterdam used to be, with a lot of Jewish families living there. So you have this map of Amsterdam where they meticulously mark, okay, so we have a lot of work to do here, we don't have a lot of work to do. And that mentality was found in a lot of government organizations throughout the Netherlands. So within the police, a lot of mayors and the people that work for them. So there was this altogether sensation of cooperation, and also how can we make this more efficient. So in Westerbork, for instance, you had this camp commander, he's called Gemmeker, and he had a lot of Dutch, a lot of Dutch people working for him, and their mentality was always, don't use force, always make sure there is no panic. So very strategic way of keeping people calm, and that was used throughout the Netherlands to make people cooperate. So Jannie in the book, as I mentioned, Jannie and Lien, the two sisters, for me, the most interesting part about the two sisters where they represent the mentality of the Netherlands, which is Lien, the older one, who is a bit naive, which was the majority of the Dutch people. She's like, of course we're occupied, and of course they're coming after the Jews, but it will be fine. They will not harm us. And okay, so we need to go to register our passports and put a J for Jew inside. Oh, that's fine. We'll just go and we'll just do it. That's the majority of the Dutch population, naive. And then we had Jannie, the younger sister, and from the get-go, she said, no, don't do anything. Look what happened in Spain with Franco and the war over there. So don't move an inch, because every inch you give to the fascists, you will never get back. So don't go and register. And she was the only one in her family. Almost every Jew in the Netherlands went, because everybody was, the atmosphere was quite obedient also for non-Jewish people and Jewish people as well. That was the atmosphere.
How would you explain the fact that this story was not previously told, that it had to wait for so long for you, so many decades later, to be told?
It was told in different ways and on smaller platforms, but never really centered around them. So it was told in a way that in the Anne Frank Museum, they are mentioned as the sisters who told Otto Frank. And Willy Lindner, who is a very famous cinematographer, he made an award-winning, an Emmy-winning documentary on Anne Frank. And in it, he interviews one of my sisters, Jannie Brilleslijper, and she's asked about her experiences with Anne Frank in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. So, snippets of very small parts of the story were told all over the place, but nobody had ever, looked into the house as the center of resistance, and basically the story of the sisters completely independent from the Anne Frank story. So in my book, I focus on everything that happened to the sisters, and then, of course, when they are in Auschwitz, I do mention that they meet Anne and Margot Frank. They met her actually in Westerbork. They see them again at Auschwitz, and they travel then to Bergen-Belsen. And I had to mention it. I was a bit hesitant at first because I thought I don't want to be accused of lifting along with this very famous story. But then again, I thought, it's the truth, so I can't leave it out. So it's at the end of the book, and I make it as small as possible. But I had to mention it because it's the truth.
It just seems really incredible to me that, because it seems such an important part of what we know about the resistance, right? Hiding is usually told as something that was organized by non-Jews. And here it's actually a story of a hiding place that is told in so many countries. And I can speak from Polish experience. I also do research on a story of this one Jewish Polish woman who's trying to hide in hiding places in France. And those stories are so ingrained into sort of a public memory of, heroism and hiding places organized by society. And here you have hiding spots organized by Jews themselves. That adds so much to what we know about resistance during the war. That's why I was really puzzled by the fact that, it took so many decades to popularize it, to actually deliver it to the wider public. And maybe it's for the better, because this was done in such a beautiful and evocative way. What were the biggest silences or perhaps surprises that you managed to unravel in the process?
I think both my own surprise is the biggest surprise with the reader, with the audience as well, which was when I was traveling through Israel. And in the Netherlands, the main view towards me and my research was, what a shame that you're focusing on the war. We don't need more war stories. What a shame for your career, because, your other book was so good, and now you're writing about the Second World War. Nobody wants to read about that. So that was, I was used to this lack of interest. And then I was traveling through Israel doing research for the book. The book hadn't been written yet. And there I met people, and they said, you need to tell this story because it is a story of not only Jewish resistance, but also Jewish culture being in full bloom in the middle of Nazi territory, like it says on the book, because we are here in this area of 5-6 villages, which were well known for their very high concentration of Nazi and Dutch Nazi people. So, and there you have these two Jewish sisters, not only being part of a very professionally organized resistance group, several groups actually, but also, this house full of famous musicians and journalists and authors and artists. There were opera nights being organized. There were Yiddish music being written, which I have in my possession still. So I think basically that for me was an eye-opener, because I thought, you're right. I should not, with my head be stuck in the Dutch narrative of, oh, this is another war story. It's not another war story. It's completely opposite of what we read and view about, or at least in the Netherlands, what we think we know about the war.
Yeah, I fully agree. And that's why I think maybe we needed to get the story differently first in order to actually open venues for the sort of more personal approach, but not only more personal, that's not what I'm trying to say, the approach that actually shows the life that is flourishing, if not, that more than continues, right? That actually grows despite the oppression and the war circumstances and security and fears and anxieties, all of that, but also, you know, life that is actually able to protect other lives. Maybe we needed to get different stories first before we are able to hear this. So I have a couple more questions. Some of them are rather personal and some of them are perhaps larger. So I'll start with a larger one. And this also speaks to one of the questions that we received from the audience. I'm very curious about the reception of this book, first of all, and then what are the consequences? Are there any markers in the public space that are being introduced to commemorate this family and what they did? Perhaps there is a movie in the making, a museum exhibit. Are you thinking about turning your house, because as I understand, you live in the same place, into a museum? What are the larger consequences for the larger public of this book?
Well, to start with the last one, no, we just live here as a family, and it's been very hectic because usually the topics that I write about are not, you know, widely being read. It's not. I write about topics that are not, you know, for a very broad audience. Although that's prejudice, because now I wrote this book and all of a sudden it did connect with a broader audience. But I was a bit naive because I expected the book to not have a very big audience, because I thought, you know, it's so detailed about the war. It's very raw material when it comes to Dutch identity. We really have to look in the mirror. So I thought, you know, the reception maybe will not be very good because I speak about this dark side of our history, which, you know, in the Netherlands we don't really like to look at that. And also that, like I said, the Jewish culture that blossomed in this house, and the fact that really nobody cared about that for over 75 years, when the house was just still there and all the material was there. So I never expected it to blow up like this. And I think mainly because my luck, I think it's also luck, but it's because an audience of historians picked it up, and also an audience of, you know, just readers, the readers that were not particularly looking for a war book. So the mix of that, I think that was my luck, that they both of those audiences picked it up. And the result is that we have a lot of people every day outside of the house that come from, you know, sometimes abroad, most people from the Netherlands or Belgium, Germany as well. And they make day trips to the house, which is sometimes really awkward because you go out and you go to work, or the children go to school, and people are there, and, you know, they ask questions. And so that's really strange sometimes. And, you know, it's a family house. So, you know, at first, there was this old lady, and she said, I really want to come and you know, take a look. And it was only one lady. So I was like, okay, you can come in. But after hundreds of people have asked, I'm like, no, nobody's allowed in anymore. So, but I can tell you that, for instance, you know, my daily life is completely intertwined with the family. Where I'm sitting right now, you know, my desk, this is where I did most of my the research that I could do in the house, with all the books here, and I did most of the writing. When the children of the sisters, who were also in this house in hiding and luckily survived the war, when most of the people did not return after the camps, when one of the children was standing there at the door, and she saw the chair here, and she said, do you realize that this is the place where my father, my mother, and I were the day the Jew hunters surrounded the house. So they were actually in this room because this was their living room. This was the place they stayed as a young family. And mom and dad saw the Jew hunters outside, and small Katinka, who was 4 at the time, they could not open the hatch anymore because the Jew hunters already saw them. And under my chair, there is a secret tunnel which goes under the house, exits in the forest. And so Father Eberhard, he said, you know, there's no time anymore to go into the tunnel and escape. But what I can do is, you know, maybe they won't notice, I can hide our identity papers. So they won't know that, you know, Lynn was fully Jewish. They weren't married, so the child was fully Jewish. So, you know, they were going to be deported if they found those papers. So Katinka, she visited us, and she was standing there, and she said, do you realize that the exact same place where my father tried to delete us, tried to delete our identities, is the exact same place where you brought to life our story? So it's in our daily life here in the house.
That's chilling. I mean, it just literally, you know, chills went through my spine when I heard that. Because it almost seems to me like there was somebody out there that was almost guiding the process. But, you know, and I've been to Amsterdam a couple of times, and a couple of times I tried to enter Anne Frank house, and there are tons of people in front of it. It's impossible to enter. You can only imagine how many people try to see your house, because if that's linked to Anne Frank's story, and if that's how probably some people will read your story too, that, you know, a perfect opportunity. And I probably will be one of those people, you know, walking around your house trying to see it. Any plans? Actually, there are two questions sort of linked to this question. Any backlash, any criticism that came from people that are trying to sort of defend the Dutch honor? And this is coming from a Polish historian that sees that kind of backlash and discussions daily.
Yes, no, of course, no. I mean, also, well, you know as well, as a woman in the public atmosphere, and but I was used to that already because, like I said, I write a lot about migration, and I write a lot about economics and globalization, politics. So I was kind of used to the hate that you get when you go out there. And well, of course, if you write about persecution, about discrimination, about isolation, propaganda, what I really wanted to do in the book is take the reader, even if they think they're not interested, take the reader without him knowing it through the mechanisms that we see in every process of dehumanization and discrimination. So, you know, I've written about other genocides and other dictatorships and other forms of persecution. So I really wanted to be part of the story without readers thinking, oh, I'm just reading a history book and it's boring and I want to put it away. So, and of course there's going to be backlash. I did the 4th of May lecture this year, the national lecture that the 4th of May is our commemoration day. 5th of May is Liberation Day, and the 4th of May is remembering the victims of the war. And I did the national lecture, and I spoke about this part of the Dutch people where we don't want to look at our dark side. And we don't want to hear the voices that tell us a different story than, oh, all our grandfathers were in the resistance. Not all our grandfathers were in the resistance. Hardly all of our grandfathers were. It's good to have heroes, but it's also good to have a full story. And a lot of people responded to that as well, saying, you know, let bygones be bygones. And, you know, who cares what our part in the Second World War was, you know, shut up already. So you always get criticism, but that's good. let them have a discussion and let them disagree. Or it's good to have a discussion about these things. I do my research very thoroughly, so it's not that I'm standing there just saying things and thinking, okay, so maybe that was really BS. That was not true. So I think very hard before I speak in public.
A movie, or maybe an additional exhibit, maybe a special room that is adjacent to the Anne Frank's museum that is devoted to your story.
Oh, I don't think the Anne Frank Museum would want that. No, I think they're very protective, of course, of and rightfully so, of the legacy of Anne Frank. No, I did do a here it is. I received, it's this. It's in Dutch, but it has quotes here of letters that I received from war victims. I think, throughout these past few years of doing research and writing the book, I wrote another book on the Rwandan genocide, and I received so many letters of traumatized people and, grandparents saying, I could never speak about the war, so I gave your book to my grandchildren and my children, and now we have a discussion. Or people saying, I really love my mother, but she survived the camps and she came back unable to love anymore because that was the only way she could have survived the camps. So I received hundreds of, handwritten, beautiful, heartbreaking letters. And I thought, I have to do something with that. So that's when I made this book, which is called Letters to the Highness, because it's literally what it is. And I made a selection, of course, leaving out all intimate details and asking permission to everyone that wrote me. But it's basically a book about intergenerational trauma, about silence, about emotionally blocked people, and about the universal experience of what it does to a people and to individual people when you are left out and persecuted.
So let me ask you this sort of more personal and maybe a little bit more controversial question before I ask a final question. I don't see more questions coming from the audience. They may come in the meantime. So there is always an element of autobiography in every work we're doing. So at some point, there was something that you said that made me think about this. With which of the sisters you associate more? Is there one that you feel is closer to you?
That's a good question. Yes, and I think you know the answer because I think it becomes quite clear in the book as well. That's, of course, the freedom you have as an author. So you have the two sisters, Lien, who was, after the war, became a very famous singer of Jewish songs with her husband and her two daughters. And she was quite vocal and outspoken. And then you had Yanni, the younger sister, who was a very stubborn, difficult, and she was in some ways the opposite of Lien, but they loved each other dearly, but they could fight like cats. And Yanni was the one who always refused to talk after the war. So she always said, all the people that are doing the talking, they weren't really there. So, that kind of woman, that's the kind of woman she was. And it was Willy Lindwer who made the film, The Last 7 Months of Anne Frank. You should watch it on YouTube. It's for free. It's the final 7 months, I think, of Anne Frank. And it's a documentary where he interviews ladies of, elderly ladies who witnessed her final 7 months, and Jannie Brilleslijper is one of them. And that's the very first time she wanted to speak up about the war. And only, of course, the part that concerned Anne Frank. And, reading Yanni's diaries and the difficult woman that she wasn't a difficult woman. She was just not a woman that women were expected to be at that time. So she made up her own mind. She made her own decisions. She never asked permission to her husband. She never asked permission from her father or her mother. And I just immediately fell for this woman. And I thought, oh my God, what a role model for me as well, as a woman who is, hardly ever, I never face what she had to face on a daily basis, never. And I still find daily life sometimes difficult. And I thought, my God, I should be ashamed of myself seeing her courage in those times. So I thought, Yanni was for me the hardest nut to crack. Took me the longest to find her voice. And then after I finished the first raw manuscript, I sent it to her son, Robbie, who was also in hiding in the house when he was 4.5. And he texted me in the middle of the night and he said, you found the voice of my mother. So, then let all the critics come.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Hey, let me ask the last question, unless there will be more coming from the audience. What are you working on right now? What is your next project?
Yeah, it's nice of you to ask. Well, of course, I'm very grateful that my translation of The High Nest is now in the United States, which is beyond what I ever expected it to be. I mean, it was in the New York Times. It's still in the New York Times bestsellers list. It was in the indie bookstores bestseller list, which is, of course, I mean, you can only dream of something like that. So I'm so glad that their story is being told, and I'm taking time to do lectures and interviews. And I'm writing on 2 books again. I always write fiction and nonfiction, and I really like the combination. So I'm doing research for a nonfiction book, which will be again about conflict. And I'm writing a novel. Well, all my books are about conflict. I'm writing a novel which is more about a family. It's a smaller story about a family in conflict, but the nonfiction will be about an episode of war again. So it's always a couple of years before a book is finished.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for caring and for writing this book. And here I'm quoting one of the comments from the chat section. And from me, thank you so much for sharing your story, for being here with us today, for answering my questions. It was a pleasure. And I hope to see you maybe in person at some point.
Yes, that would be nice.
That would be
what
awesome.
are you working on right now? Because I really want to know.
I actually am writing. I just finished a story of a Polish Jewish woman who was in France hiding throughout the war and participating in the Spanish Civil War, and then was trying to find hiding spots in France. And it's based on the correspondence letters that she kept sending back and forth to her family that was actually in Palestine. And then she returned to Poland after the war. So, there are some intersections between your book and your work. So this conversation was fascinating, and I do appreciate you taking time to be here with us today.
No, thank you very much. And thank you for your work, because I know doing research on Holocaust from a Polish perspective is also a sensitive topic.
It is.
I get a lot of criticism from Polish people if I use, in their view, the wrong kind of wording. Like, for instance, if I refer to a Polish concentration camp anywhere in public, I immediately get a lot of hate mail.
It's a tricky territory. It's a very tricky territory. But we do it. There is We do it. We have to do it. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, thank you, and it was very nice speaking to you.